Hey everyone, welcome to Kinesiology 2030, and today's lecture is Lecture 7, Creating a Physically Active Lifestyle. This is from Chapter 4 in our textbook, and what we're going to be talking about essentially is just physically active lifestyle. We're going to talk about how we can start implementing physical activity into our life a little bit easier. We'll go over some of the barriers that people put up for themselves, and we'll talk about some of the key prescriptions in terms of what physical activity is. Now, this is going to be a separate lecture from Lecture 8, which is going to be movement, and we're going to talk more about movement lifestyle versus physical activity lifestyle in that second lecture. But right now, what I want to talk about is physical activity and look at how we need to start incorporating physical activity in our daily life, because it is starting to lead to some very problematic aspects in our society. And we're going to start by looking first and foremost at the leading causes of death in our country. So this is from Stats Canada 2018. And essentially I put here the top 8 ranking leading causes of death in our country. So first you can see cancer, second you can see heart disease, third you can see is cerebrovascular disease, which is stroke, 4 is accidents, 5 is chronic lower respiratory disease, 6 is influenza and pneumonia, 7 is diabetes, and 8 is Alzheimer's. Now, if you take a hard look at that and think about these leading causes of death and what they all are sort of associated with, and I could easily argue with you that aside from accidents, the other 7 we could contribute to poor lifestyle. I realize that not all cancers can be prevented by lifestyle, but a certain amount of them could be, like digestive cancers for one, can be essentially limited for potential risk and prevented through physical activity and proper nutrition. We also talked about how sleep can help with the decreased risk of cancer. So we can't say that cancer is completely preventable through physical activity, but we definitely can say that physical activity, proper nutrition, proper sleep, and stress management can definitely lower your odds of certain cancers. Some cancers potentially could be predisposed through genetic conditions, but other cancers are not. And a lot of them do have to do with poor physical activity and poor nutrition and not enough sleep. So right off the bat, that first one, I can argue with you that if we live a physically active life style with good nutrition and proper sleep and stress management, we can decrease the risk. Diseases of the heart are a complete disease of civilization. And what I mean by disease of civilization essentially is a disease that has been created from how we live in today's society and in our civilization. So diseases of the heart is something that has been on the rise for the last 100 years as a leading cause of death. We'll take a look at the history of disease of the heart here in terms of when it became a leading cause of death and how long it was the leading cause of death. But disease of the heart is, having high cholesterol, plaque buildup. Heart disease is strictly a lifestyle choice, right? We've looked at how genetics does play a role, but it's a minor role. It becomes at that epigenetic level in that case, which is really your lifestyle and your environment that cause this disease. And so when it comes to disease of the heart, physical activity, proper nutrition, and sleep is definitely going to decrease your risk of coming down with any type of cardiovascular disease. When we look at cerebrovascular or stroke, again, that's tied into diseases of the heart as well. It has its own category because it is a little bit different because it involves the brain, but it is when there's a blockage um, to one of the main arteries that supplies the blood to the brain. And then when that artery gets blocked by plaque buildup, inflammation, and blood can't get to the brain, then we have a stroke. Accidents, I mean, we can probably look at that as being lifestyle choice to a certain extent. Some accidents are just, you know, have nothing to do with your lifestyle or anything. It's just could be dumb luck. But I mean, there's choices you can make that can help you reduce your risks of death. Wearing a seatbelt, for one, would reduce your risk of death from an accident. So, I mean, there's some lifestyle choices we can say are can reduce the risk of death by accident, but definitely some accidents are just unfortunate, and there's not much we can do about it, and nothing to do with lifestyle. But then we get back into the next one here, chronic lower respiratory disease. Okay, that's things like lung problems. And again, that is a lifestyle aspect. If you're someone who smokes or someone who, you know, chooses to live in an environment where there's poor air quality, sometimes we don't have that choice. But we can have the choice if you know we have the means to. But most chronic lower respiratory diseases do involve smokers. I believe the smoking rate is starting to decrease, but we are starting to see an increase in vape smoking, which is fairly new, and there's not a lot of research and evidence, but doctors are starting to see that vape smoke is actually potentially worse than cigarette smoke because of the sheer volume of smoke that goes into your lungs from it. So that's something to look for in future research is how vape smoke is going to decrease the risk of or increase the risk of chronic lower respiratory disease as well. Influenza and pneumonia, why I chalk that up to lifestyle is because if you are physically active, you eat healthily, and you get enough sleep, well, your immune system is going to be extremely high functioning, which means when you get a common flu, common cold bug, your immune system is going to be able to fight it off. It's not going to lead to pneumonia. It's not going to lead to a flu that is so bad that you potentially might die from it. So being physically active and eating healthy and getting enough sleep is going to help strengthen that immune system and really help you with fighting flus and colds and not having them turn into something far worse. Diabetes is definitely one that is lifestyle choice, and another one that I would call disease of civilization. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder, which means usually it is genetic, you are born with it. Some people potentially develop it later on. But type 2 diabetes is not. Type 2 diabetes is strictly lifestyle. Poor eating, not enough physical activity, not enough sleep. And because of that, our insulin is not able to regulate itself. And then that eventually leads to damage to the pancreas, which leads to type 2 diabetes. Right now in British Columbia, we are seeing 35% of our population that is either diabetic or pre-diabetic, which means their blood sugar levels are above what normal blood sugar levels should be. So 35% of our province has diabetes or pre-diabetes, which means it's a high percentage of our population that is not living a physically active lifestyle, who is eating nutritiously and getting enough sleep. And then Alzheimer's disease, we're starting to see a real strong link with research in Alzheimer's disease with physical activity, and physical activity decreasing the risk of when Alzheimer's disease sets in, as well as with dementia. So we're actually starting to see that Alzheimer's disease can be potentially linked as a disease of civilization. We looked at Alzheimer's disease and it's linked to sleep. So again, if we're staying physically active and we're getting an adequate amount of sleep, we reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So it's important to note that's a potential disease of civilization that's coming up. And you're going to hear me using that term disease of civilization quite often when we talk about these types of diseases, because that's what they are. All right. When we look at worldwide death rates in first world countries or the richer countries, you see all of these disease of the heart, stroke, uh, diabetes, all being near the top. And that is just strictly due to the fact that we are not physically active enough and we're not eating properly. And now starting to link the sleep into it, we're not sleeping enough. Right? So that's where I say civilization has a very important, impactful role in the types of diseases that are causing death. And so, any type of disease that we see within our civilization that is one that is not so, uh, that is controllable through our actions, I refer to as disease of civilization. Now, if we compare the leading causes of death from now and from 1900, we'll see a completely different look. All right, so in 1900, according to the Center for Disease Control, the leading cause of death in 1900 was influenza and pneumonia. All right, and then tuberculosis was two, and then diarrhea and intestinal problems was number three. So right off the bat, the most glaring thing that should come up is the top three causes of death in the 1900 were essentially common bugs that we face all the time here. But right now, only influenza and pneumonia is in the top 8 in terms of leading causes of death. So essentially, what has happened is obviously modern medicine has changed considerably, and we don't have to be fearful of illnesses like flu, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and common um, common digestive bugs uh, that we're starting to obviously look at those being really non-factors in terms of death, and it's going to the disease of the heart, which you can see is number 4 at that in that time in the 1900s. And then number 5 was intracranial lesions, which is essentially stroke. Nephritis, which is kidney disease. And then again, accidents and cancer was number 8. Now, cancer in the 1900s there's probably a lot more cancer deaths than people probably understood back then. But you can see it was in the top 8. But the key to this is just the top 3. Right? In the 1900s, a common flu or common digestive problem was something that was potentially going to lead to death because they just didn't have the medical means to really withstand it and withstand what it could do. So that's kind of interesting when it comes to 1900s. But again, you can see that there's not diabetes, diseases of the heart's a little bit further down. There's no Alzheimer's. So there was less of the diseases of civilization. And a lot of that had to do, too, with what society was like in the 1900s. It wasn't, the Industrial Revolution obviously happened several decades before the 1900s, but it still wasn't quite as built up as it is now. And things like refined sugar weren't at an abundance. there wasn't the amount of packaged type foods that we have now. All right, so it was still a lot more go to the farm, pick up what you needed, or farmers markets or trading than it is now. So nutrition and physical activity wasn't really an issue in the 1900s um, because not everyone had access to what we have access to now. The people who were richer back then did, and that's when you probably saw the diseases of the heart were people who had a little bit more money back then. And it's kind of interesting because if we look even further into the centuries, the times of kings and uh, who ruled areas. It was actually a thing of power if you were overweight, because it meant you had all the money, you had all the food, and you didn't have to do anything. And so it was if you were overweight and not physically active, you were powerful, which is kind of an interesting aspect when it comes to history of physical activity and nutrition. So, anyways, going back to the 1900s, which is 120 years ago, we saw these common issues that we just deal with, no problem, being the things that killed people. Now, a little bit of history of um, the leading causes of death. We saw in 1900s the diseases of the heart were fourth. Well, in 1910, that was the first year diseases of the heart was the leading cause of death. So that's when we started seeing um, diseases of the heart becoming the most prevalent death in society. And then we have 1918 to 1920. We saw diseases of the heart drop to number 2, and influenza and pneumonia going back up to 1. Now, if you know your history, you know between 1918 and 1920, there was a pandemic known as the Spanish flu. And so the Spanish flu made the pneumonia and influenza go back to number 1, as worldwide it was estimated to kill 17 to 50 million people. And there are some historians that are saying it possibly could be as high as 100 million people that died of the Spanish flu. So you can see between that 1918 to 1920 is influenza and pneumonia went back up to number 1, while heart disease went to 2. And then 1921, diseases of the heart was back to the leading causes of death. And worldwide, it's still, as of 2016, the leading cause of death, although I believe now cancer has taken over that. I haven't seen any updated world leading causes of death just from 2016, but I believe cancer's up there now too. I think it might be taken over as number 1. Then in 1938, that was the first time we saw cancer move to number 2 of the leading causes of death. So between 1921 to, I believe, around 2016 is when we saw cardiovascular disease or disease of the heart being the leading cause of death. So for over 100 years, or just almost 100 years, a little under 100 years, sorry, the diseases of the heart were the leading cause of death. We'll see what happens when, usually it's every 4 years, so we should be seeing some new stats coming up soon in terms of what the leading of the cause of death worldwide is. But for almost 100 years, we saw diseases of the heart being the leading cause of death. And as kinesiologists, future health advocates, one thing I really suggest for you to do is really look into the history of physical activity and nutrition. We'll talk about the history of nutrition a little bit in this course. But it's really interesting to see how diseases of the heart really impacted how nutrition was viewed for years and years and why nutrition changes so much, right? Physical activity is relatively black and white in terms of if you are physically active regularly, you considerably decrease your risk for diseases of civilization. But nutrition, it's always changing. And the history of it is just a phenomenal thing to understand. And when we get into nutrition, we'll talk about it, and I'll point you in some directions of a couple books that really, really do a good job of outlining the history of nutritionism and how it's changed and shaped what we think about certain foods. And anyways, I digress from that because that's all in the nutrition section that's coming the second half of the course. The next thing I want to look at is that 2016 world leading cause of death. And so you can see it's pretty consistent when it comes to diseases of civilization, right? So we see cardiovascular disease way up there, cancer number 2, respiratory disease 3, diabetes 4, lower respiratory infections 5, dementia 6. So again, then we go back to accidents, again, diarrhea diseases, which is interesting that that's still there in the world, and that's the third world problem when it comes to the amount of people that die from diarrhea, because it just causes dehydration and they can't fix it because they don't have the means. But it's still out there, which is interesting. But when you get into the world, you can kind of see that the pneumonia and influenza isn't quite there. So as I said, it'll be interesting to see when the new stats come out and what it shows. But as of now, we essentially stick with cardiovascular disease and cancer are the two biggest killers in our society. And in reality, both of them can be considerably decreased through physical activity. And that's what I want to focus on. I know nutrition and sleep's part of it, but we covered sleep so you understand the importance of sleep. And we're going to cover nutrition so you'll understand the importance of nutrition. So in terms of what we want to focus on for this lecture, we're going to focus on how an active living can significantly decrease the risk of those diseases of civilization. So active living essentially is living a lifestyle that has regular exercise, regular physical activity, regular movement, whatever you want to call it. And there are some guidelines that all societies put out for their population. So Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology recommends that adults aged 18 to 64 years should obtain at least 2.5 hours of physical activity each week. And one thing that we could note is physical activity should be in bouts of 10 minutes or more, and it should be moderate to vigorous intensity. So I always suggest that when we get into moderate to vigorous intensity, we're exercising. That, to me, is exercise. It's not just physical activity, it's exercise. So essentially, we should be exercising for at least 2.5 hours each week. Now, if we look at what moderate intensity is classified, moderate intensity is, you can classify it as a couple things. 40 to 60% of our aerobic capacity, or 50 to 70% of our maximum heart rate capacity. When you get into our Kinesiology 1120 course, you'll talk about all of this in way more detail. In our 3303 course, you'll go into even more detail, which is our resistance training course. And when you get exercise physiology, you'll get it even in more detail than that. All right? But when it comes to just understanding what it is, it's just this. This moderate intensity requires 40 to 60% of aerobic capacity, or 50 to 70% of maximum heart rate capacity. Now, moderate intensity would require you to have bouts or doses of exercise that are longer period of time, right? So 30, 45 minutes, maybe 60 minutes. Okay, if you're 40 to 60%, you're probably going to need to work 60 minutes to get any type of physical activity, exercise benefit. 50 to 70% is a little higher intensity. It's still moderate, so we could probably in around the 30 to 45 minutes, depending on your exercise ability. Right, then we get into vigorous intensity. Vigorous intensity is 60 to 80% of our aerobic capacity, or 90 to 85% of our max heart rate. So again, this is pretty high intensity. 70 to 85% is usually what athletes train at regularly. So you can see when you get into that 70 to 85% of your max heart rate, you're doing more of an athletic type training. Right, so again, the time is going to differ based on what the activity is, what your fitness level is. So 60 to 80%, 20 to 35, maybe 40 minutes. 70 to 85% is going to be 10 to 20 minutes, and you're probably going to want to do intervals with work to rest. So that would increase the total time of exercise. So the total time of exercise really depends on a lot of different variations. But since we're just talking about what active living is, what physical activity is, these are good moderate intensity, vigorous intensity guidelines. And most of you will probably know for yourself how long you can maintain those intensities for, and what would be appropriate for someone you're potentially working with. Now, when it comes to this active living, we have to realize that it is a lifestyle, and it should be approached as a lifestyle. And really, it's just being physically active. It's a lifestyle that involves physical activity. So essentially, it just means requiring yourself to move more throughout the day. And just little simple, as you know, I call them movement vitamins. Just real simple movement vitamins that you can do throughout the day, right? And it's just choosing to move versus choosing to be sedentary. So when it comes to being in a building, just taking the stairs versus taking an elevator. And my thoughts on how every little bit helps and small changes make the biggest difference. And if you take the stairs, if you've never taken the stairs before, you always took elevator, and you decided, okay, from now on, I'm taking the stairs every time, it's going to make a big difference. It's going to be eventually an impactful difference. And you may feel tired at the first of it when you first start it, but your body will adapt quickly. And when your body adapts, walking up the stairs will be simple. Right? And then things like taking a bike or walking instead of driving, that's another easy thing to do. And I know I've told my story about how I walk my kids to school instead of drive them to school. And that gives me a 60 minutes of moderate intensity walking a day. And so, it's just choosing to move versus being sedentary. Because sedentary lifestyle is really what is the problem with our society, and why these diseases of civilization are starting to become so prevalent in our society, is because too many of us are choosing to be sedentary versus choosing to be movers. And what we want to do is move. And we can move, as I said, just simple movement vitamins, or by incorporating more recreational activities in your life as well, right? Going for hikes, playing catch, or any other sports. Having active dates with your friends, so walk in the park, bike in the park, paddle boarding on the ocean, right? Just be a little bit more active. I always find this course, it's by far, like, it's such an important course, and it's one of my favorite courses. And one of the things that I always laugh at is, especially when I get into this physical activity part of it, is I always hear students say, oh yeah, like, this part is just common sense. Like, it's just common sense. And my argument to them is, if this is common sense, then why is no one doing it? How is it common sense if not the entire population is living an active lifestyle, because stats are showing that there's more percentage of people who are sedentary in our society than are movers. So, as much as it may seem like common sense, it's not common sense because people aren't doing it. If it was common sense, I wouldn't have to get all fired up about it. We wouldn't have cardiovascular disease is killing such a large percentage of our population, right? So it might be common sense, but it has to actually be acted upon. So that's one thing. If you ever hear someone say that it's common sense, then ask them that question. Then why isn't no one doing it? Another way we can look at physical activity is having more active transportation. I mean, this is a big one, right? We're using another form of energy other than our own to get where we need to go. And if you look back at our ancestors and how they lived, I mean, their primary form of transportation was their own legs. That's how they got around. They went from everywhere where they needed to go in order to move and go elsewhere, and they just walked, right? So they just walked. And that's one thing we just need to add more into our lifestyle, is just walking more, right? In the reality, if you live in a major city, if you have to go somewhere that is 2 kilometers or less, walking is going to be your fastest mode of transportation. Getting in a car, getting it out of the parking lot, driving, finding parking, and then going, that is going to take you a lot longer than if you just walk. So we have to think about that. And I know we live in an area where it is wet a lot, and walking is like, oh God, if I walk, I'm going to get soaked. All right. But it's still going to be faster. Okay. Use an umbrella, wear the proper clothing, and just walk. Right? Not only are you saving yourself, you are saving the environment with that as well. In cities, it is faster to cycle 10 kilometers or less versus any other form of transportation. Because when we walk and we cycle, it's literally point A to point B. If we have to take transportation, if we have to take a bus or a SkyTrain, or we have to drive, there's all these little workarounds that we have to do in order to get from point A to point B. So walking, cycling, if you look at those couple ranges, they are faster. Now, if we look at some surveys, we look at some stats, only 6 to 7% of Canadians walk to work, and about 1% cycle to work. Right? So it's not a huge percentage, and so that means it's a lot of cars on the road, and that's a lot of sedentary behavior. I mean, it's sometimes you can't get around it. Society brings you challenges such as cost of living, and living close to where you work or where you go to school may not be an option, and you have to transport with a car versus a bike or walking or any other mode of transportation. You have to drive. If that's the case, then and try and figure out how to incorporate movement before and after you drive, because sitting in a car it's hard on the body. As much as you might not realize it, it's hard on the body. That sitting position, that load profile of sitting, is just shortening your muscles, and it is creating stiffness, it is creating tightness. So some movement vitamins before, after long drives is key. Now, when it comes to exercise, exercise tends to be physical activity, and it refers to any bodily movement that engages the skeletal muscles and expends calories. So when we look at exercise, we're not really thinking about physical activity, we're thinking more about physical fitness. And so that's a real big difference between physical activity and exercise, is fitness. So being physically active you definitely want to incorporate fitness and exercise into your physical activity. But just being a mover, like just moving more, is more of being physically active, and sometimes it's going to incorporate exercise and sometimes it's not. uh, so we have to sort of sit down and evaluate how much did we move, and that's why I put that into that behavioral journal, like how much did you move today, so you kind of have an idea. Because if you don't move a lot, then you need to incorporate more exercise into your daily plan, right? So you can have fitness. So when it looks at physical fitness, it refers to our ability to accomplish all that we need to do in a day while still having energy left over for emergency situations. And it's divided into two components. It's health related fitness and performance related fitness. And it's health and skill. So performance related components are more when you are involved in sport, where health is just exercise that helps with your health. When you get into 1120, you'll go into these in more detail, and I'm not going to touch on them here. Your textbook has what health and performance related components are, but they're more associated with exercise. So exercise essentially refers to the intention to move, often with a repetitive pattern and a desire to enhance or maintain the health-related components of physical fitness. Training involves planned, structured movements done repetitively with the goal of improving performance-related components of physical fitness. So when we get into fitness, we can break it up into exercise and training. Exercise is when we're just interested in our health-related components, and training is when we want to get into the performance. If you're an athlete, you need to incorporate both, because exercise and training is going to result in high fitness level, and that's what an athlete needs. So when we look at exercise and the relationship between physical activity, physical fitness, and health, it's actually triangular. So high levels of physical activity are associated with better health outcomes. Inactivity is associated with poor health, and poor health has a negative impact on the level of physical activity. So what you need to find is a balance. You need to find a balance of being physically active and exercising to help with fitness. Because the better fitness level you have, the more decreased risk of diseases of civilization. If you have a high fitness level, it means you have a healthy heart. It means you have healthy lungs. It means that your immune system is high. It means that you're burning energy and you're going to be tired at night and ready to go to sleep, right? So I personally, as a strength and conditioning coach, I'm very mindful of training, and I do a ton of training myself. It's part of my physical activity routine, right? I lift weights, I run, I do sprint work, I go beyond the 2.5 hours that is recommended, right? And that 2.5 hours is sort of the baseline. It's the lowest level, all right? So I go well beyond 2.5. And the reason I do that is because it's what I enjoy, and it's what I do when it comes to my physical activity. My physical activity involves more fitness, exercise, and training because I enjoy it, and it's what keeps my body healthy in my eyes, and that's my journey. But someone might be totally different. Someone might move a ton during the day and only need 30 minutes of exercise a day because they move so much throughout the day. And if they're healthy and they feel good and that's what they enjoy, then there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's all of our journeys, and what we need to do as health advocates is find out what is best for us, and then how are we going to lead others to understand what's best for them. So understanding all of these parts are important. It's important to understand exercise. It's important to understand physical activity. It's It's important to understand fitness and health, for fitness for health and fitness for training, because it's all leading to one thing, and that's decreasing morbidity and mortality. We want to make sure that we live the longest and the highest quality of life that we can. That's the end goal for everybody. I don't know too many people who are living life as if they just want to be unhealthy and be sick and just live for a short period of time. Everyone wants to live as long as we can. And quality of life is important as well. So having good quality of life is important. So we want to decrease the risk of morbidity and mortality. And physical activity does influence it. So there is research that indicates that individuals who are the least active and least physically fit are at the greatest risk for morbidity and mortality. But at the same time, we have to realize that sometimes more is not better. As much as we have this idea that the more we do is better, that's not true. Because we can go into overtraining. And overtraining could lead to other problems, sleep problems, stress problems, right? It can do the total opposite of what we want. So we have to understand the relationship between physical activity and health. We have to find the middle ground. What is going to be ideal? And again, ideal for us. And there's several ways we can monitor it too. For most people, just rating how they feel is enough. For me personally, I use a couple metrics that involve my heart. I use resting heart rate and something called heart rate variability. Each of those tell me if I am overtraining and if I need to back off. And that's what we need to be able to do. We need to know when to back off. Because one of the most interesting things about the human body is the human body can only withstand so much of everything. The human body will try to adapt to stresses, as I've mentioned, but if we put that stress too much on our body, it won't adapt. It will start rejecting it. And it's so interesting because our body can have too much water. We can die from too much water. We can get really sick from too much exercise. So all these things that people say, that we need this, we need that, this makes us healthy, this makes us healthy. Well, too much of it can lead to serious problems. So we have to understand that more isn't necessarily better. It's finding the right amount is the best. So let's look at the diseases of civilization. So cardiovascular health for me, is one of the most important ones to look at, because as much as some people may think it's not in your control, it is totally in your control. I am living proof of cardiovascular health being under your control. Because a lot of people think cardiovascular health is genetic. And they will tell you, well, that's always a question that you get when you go to the doctor. Family history. Do you have a family history of heart disease? Do you have a family history of diabetes? Well, I have a family history of heart disease. My brother has had a heart attack. My dad has high cholesterol and diabetes. My uncle has high cholesterol. All my cousins have high cholesterol. So every single male in my family, in my genetic code, has some sort of cardiovascular health problem. Whether it is they've had a blockage already, or they have high cholesterol or high blood pressure. Every single male in my family. So, by the genetic definition, I should have it. I should have it. But I don't. I don't have any cholesterol problems. I don't have any heart problems. My heart is strong. My heart is healthy. And the one thing that is different between all of us is I have what I think is a good diet. I have a good body composition. I exercise and am physically active regularly. And I sleep enough and I reduce my stress. So, by all means, by engineering a lifestyle and environment around me that is conducive to health, I have beat my genetic code, as they would say, but in reality, it's not. The genetics are there. All the other days have the genetic code as well. The only thing is their epigenetics, the environment that they surrounded themselves with, was different. And so that led to a far easier route to having heart problems because their lifestyle is different, right? Their lifestyle is different. For some, it was other. Like my dad, for example, it wasn't anything to do with exercise or nutrition because he exercised regularly and he ate relatively well. But for him, it was stress. He had a high stress job and he didn't manage the stress, and it caused blood pressure problems. It caused insulin deficiency, and it created problems for him. So it's as much as people say it's genetic, it's not. You control it. You can control your cardiovascular health with the right environment and the right lifestyle and the right understanding. For a lot of people, it's just they don't understand. They don't understand they have the ability to do that. And it's important as health advocates to let people know. So when we look at cardiorespiratory fitness, cardiorespiratory fitness refers to the ability of the heart, lungs, and vascular system to function effectively and efficiently. And when we're doing cardiorespiratory fitness, we are utilizing blood pressure, blood fats, blood sugar, body weight, stress management, and physical activity. So those are all factors in the cardiovascular system that are directly impacted by cardiovascular health. It regulates our blood pressure. It brings it down. It regulates blood fats. It regulates blood sugar. It regulates our body weight, and it helps with stress management. Primary risk factors of cardiovascular health. So, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. So, hypertension is high blood pressure. Hyperlipidemia is when we have too many triglycerides in our bloodstream, so too much fat in our bloodstream. Smoking obviously is going to have a humongous impact on cardiovascular health, and I think for the most part, we all are aware of that now. And inactivity. Inactivity is the biggest one. It's the biggest one. If you're not putting your heart through physical stress through exercise, it's not going to get strong. It's going to become weak, and it's going to become ineffective, and it's going to lead to potential problems. Secondary risk factors of cardiovascular health are stress, and right now obesity. But I have a funny feeling that obesity is going to climb to the top of primary risk factors for cardiovascular health in a very, very short period of time. We're starting to see obesity as being, it doubles your chance of cardiovascular health problems. It doubles your chance of diabetes. So right now it's a secondary risk, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be top of the primary risk soon. Diabetes, another disease of civilization. And what diabetes is it refers to a group of diseases characterized by persistently high levels of glucose in the blood. So we have type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is an autoimmune disease where our immune system destroys insulin making beta cells. So this is something that is one of those ones that's genetic, it's beyond our control. The amount of exercise we do isn't going to cure diabetes, type 2 diabetes. If this is something you have, you will be insulin dependent for your entire life. Exercise can certainly help it. It can certainly help type 1 diabetics. Don't get me wrong. It could help ease their symptoms, ease their problems. So a type 1 diabetic definitely should be someone who is regularly physically active. Type 2 diabetes, this is when we have insulin production deficiency. So what happens is our body is not able to use all the insulin available. So this is when we have high sugar diets, high carbohydrate diets, and it's consistent, and we're constantly putting glucose into our body. And our insulin essentially just becomes deficient because we have all this blood glucose in. So our body doesn't utilize the insulin, or it's not available, and then we become type 2 diabetic. And again, this is 100% lifestyle. 100% lifestyle type 2 diabetes. This one can be prevented. It can be controlled through physical activity and diet, proper nutrition. There is something called gestational diabetes. This occurs during pregnancy, and it's more of a type 2 characteristic. And it's something that someone who is pregnant will get tested for regularly, because obviously it could cause some potential problems. So when it comes to diabetes, physical activity is important because it helps with blood sugar regulation. And in table 4.2 in your textbook, there's physical activity recommendations for individuals with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So it's good to understand this, right? So type 1 diabetes, if you've taken 1120, you probably have gone over the FIT formula: frequency, intensity, time, and type, which essentially is just how many frequency is how many days, intensity is it low, moderate, or high, or use your heart rate, time is how long, type is the type of exercise. All right. So someone who's type 1 diabetic, their frequency should be daily because it helps better their blood glucose regulation. Intensity should be the same for an individual without type 1 diabetes. Though heavy workouts using muscle or insulin, heavy workouts using the muscle where the insulin is injected should be avoided because it could just cause extra bruising, extra pain. Time should be about 20 to 30 minutes. Some research is showing that late night physical activity should be avoided with diabetics. And that's just for, again, regulation of blood glucose and insulin. And the type should be the same as an individual without type 1 diabetes, so any type of activity. So it's important to know that. It's important to know what someone with type 1 diabetes should be doing to help themselves. When it comes to type 2 diabetes, 3 to 5 times per week, 40 to 60% of aerobic capacity. Lower intensities could potentially be prescribed, given several different recommendations. Time being one of them, right? Up to 60 minutes continuous activity should be done. And again, type is same as an individual without type 2 diabetes. So whoever has type 2 diabetes, one of the key things to help is exercise. It's regular exercise. And again, it's going to help with cardiovascular function, and it's going to help regulate their blood glucose a little bit. Now, for cancer, cancer refers to a disease characterized by uncontrollable growth and spread of abnormal cells. When it comes to research there's still a lot to know about cancer. There's still a lot we don't understand about cancer and are learning constantly. We have a good idea now what it is and how it starts, um, but there's still a lot of information about cancer that we're unsure of. So, two lifestyle behaviors that increase the risk of cancer: low levels of physical activity and high levels of sedentary behavior. Right. So, any sort of excess sedentary time, 6 or more hours per day, um, and then those who meet the minimum physical activity recommendations still are risk of cancer, even if they hit their 2.5 hours per week. But if they're sitting for 6 or more hours per day, it still isn't. It's still not decreasing their risk, which is why I always say, just because you exercise 60 minutes a day doesn't mean that you're not sedentary. Because if I'm sitting in the same place for 6 or more hours per day, but I'm exercising 60 minutes a day, that sitting is not going, it's going to outweigh the exercise. It's going to really diminish the exercise. You'll still get some you'll still get some adaptations of the cardiovascular system doing that, but definitely you do not decrease your risk of certain cancers if you're excessively sedentary. So make sure you really evaluate how much time you're being sedentary, and sedentary is literally just not moving. So see how much you're not moving, and if you're not moving for 6 or more hours a day, that's problematic, and you need to think about it. So physical activity does reduce the risk for cancer by several physiological and psychological systems. So, what we're doing to help reduce the risk of cancer with exercise and physical activity is we're having regulation of energy balance. We are maintaining our body weight. We're maintaining physical fitness. We have mechanical regulation. Our immune system is functioning high, and we have good hormonal regulation. All of those are going to help decrease the risk of cancers. The immune system is the big one because obviously the immune system is what fights it. And if we have a high functioning immune system, then it's going to help reduce the risk of cancers. So I use the word reduce the risk because, like I said, we don't know a lot about some cancers. Some cancers start for the most physically active people can still get cancer because it just a cell mutated. But definitely, I always tell people, if something reduces the risk of getting cancer, why wouldn't you do it? Why not take the risk of being physically active, you know, and avoiding sedentary behavior to reduce the risk of something like that, right? Because it's obviously it's one of the leading causes of death in the world, in our country. We should try to avoid it. And physical activity, good nutrition, sleep help. So here are some physical activity suggestions for prevention, treatment, recovery, and post-treatment. And again, this is in your textbook. So you see, you just want to focus on prevention here. You can go to the textbook and look treatment, recovery, post-treatment yourself. So when it comes to prevention, daily, obviously, intensity, moderate or greater intensities, time 30 minutes, working towards 60 minutes, type a variety of activities. All right. And what you want to do is develop, maintain cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, endurance, flexibility, body composition. Really, all the health related components. Those are the types of exercise you want to do for prevention. So another thing to look at in terms of physical activity is not so much diseases of civilization that are causing death, but quality of life type problems. So musculoskeletal health is important because musculoskeletal refers to our muscles, and having good skeletal muscles, having good muscles, it just helps quality of life, right? So when we look at the musculoskeletal system, we're talking about muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones, joints, anything that's associated with tissue that allows our body to move. So activities that develop core body endurance, like yoga and other full body exercises such as push-ups and etc., weight training, running, cycling, just anything that moves your muscles. All right, that helps with musculoskeletal health. And then when we combine it with higher levels of static and dynamic balance, as well as musculoskeletal strength and endurance, it will play a big role in maintaining our posture and preventing our falls. And that's important for when we get older. But when we get into the movement lecture, I'm going to talk about posturing and talk about something called kyphosis. And this will make a lot more sense in when we get to that lecture. And kyphosis is becoming human's floppy fin. And if you've no idea what that means, you will know soon. But kyphosis is becoming our floppy fin because of how we sit and what we do daily, and not doing enough musculoskeletal strength and endurance to help with posture. So musculoskeletal health is important because it helps with quality of life first and foremost. Because when our muscles are functioning properly, they're strong, they have good endurance, the tendons are strong, the ligaments are allowed for good mobility, our joints aren't stiff, we can move freely. And freedom of movement is what makes good quality of life in terms of not being sore, not being in pain, not waking up stiff. So musculoskeletal health, it's not a disease of civilization that leads to death, but it is something that leads to poor quality of life unless we're regularly physically active. Bone health is another thing to think about. This is referring to attaining and maintaining a sufficiently strong skeleton. Early adult years, when we're developing and maintain bone density, obviously bone health is important because the bones are growing and going through rapid growth, so we want to make sure they're healthy. Then when we become older adults, there's no longer the growth happening in terms of length. There's just the appositional growth. And that point, we have a certain amount of bone density, and we need to maintain that bone density. We need the strong bones because we don't want to eventually develop osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a disease. It's a disease where our bone starts deteriorating. So the bone tissue loses its density and becomes very brittle, and we increase our risk of fracture. And that's why you hear elderly people fall down and they just break their hip on a simple fall because their bone density is so weak and their bones are so brittle that a simple fall can break. And for a lot of elderly people, it actually could lead to death because they have to go through this really invasive hip replacement surgery that some just never recover from. So again, musculoskeletal bone health, it's important because it will reduce our risk of falling as we get older, but the bone health will keep our bones strong so we avoid fractures. So we want to make sure that we are doing proper strength exercises, proper flexibility, mobility exercises, keeping the range of motion, keeping the bone dense and strong. And we do that through resistance training, moving against gravity, and having the right amount of calcium in our diet. Now, one thing that we can look at as well is stress management. Physical activity is actually a great way to help manage stress. And I've put up the discussion for what are some techniques that you use for managing your stress. And a lot of you are putting physical activity, going for a walk, going for a run, lifting weights. A lot of you are already using physical activity as a stress management tool, which is fantastic. And it's one thing that we should really understand as health advocates that if you are stressed or you're working with someone that's stressed, just getting them out and being physically active is going to be helpful. So it is a great stress tool, and it can be used for both acute as well as long-term stress effects. So acute, what happens is we get these endorphins released. You probably heard it as the runner high, and it's mood enhancing as well as pain reducing, right? So it helps acutely with decreasing stress right off the bat. And in long term, a physically fit body will actually clear stress related chemicals faster. So when you are fit and strong and we have stress related chemicals like cortisol released, our body can clear it quicker. All right, it could clear some of the stress related hormones and chemicals that come due to stress. And if we can clear them quicker, then we feel stress, either for not as long or at a reduced intensity. But again, we have to find the balance because too much exercise, too much physical activity could lead to stress. It could lead to the same problems that stress have. So we need to know what that balance is. And that's why I always use heart rate variability and resting heart rate as key metrics to understand my body's reaction to physical activity and exercise. Mental health, we're starting to see a lot of physical activity linked with mental health and increasing mental health. So we can see physical activity, it's helped with reducing some depressive symptoms for those who are mildly or moderately depressed, and a lot of that has to do with the release of endorphins, but more importantly, the better sleep. Right? Because we looked in the sleep lecture how sleep can improve mental health. So if we are regularly physically active and we're burning the energy and we're allowing our body to be tired at night, we get to sleep better. We have deeper sleeps, we have longer sleeps, and that's going to help with our emotional mental control. And then I talked about how regular physical activity is, in research, we're starting to see it preventing or at least delaying dementia and Alzheimer's. So again, physical activity linked to the prevention or delay of dementia and Alzheimer's is a real breakthrough in terms of those two diseases, because that does affect a lot of people, and it's a hard disease when people get it. If you've ever been around someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, you probably know how difficult it is. So if we can stay physically active and get enough sleep, we are reducing the risk of those. Now, a lot of the problems that come with physical activity are barriers. People set up barriers for themselves that are not allowing them to be physically active. And what essentially happens is our attitudes, the people we hang out with, circumstances we find ourselves in, locations of facilities we need, equipment needed, our expectations can either support physical activity or lead to barriers being built up. These here are sort of the common aspects of barriers that get built up for physical activity in terms of either doing them or not doing them. And it's always good to ask yourself or ask the people you're working with, what's your attitude towards physical activity? Do your friends, are they physically active? Where's the location? What equipment do you need? Because these are the things that will either determine people exercising or not exercising, or being physically active or not being physically active. So if we look at what are some of the most common barriers that people put up for themselves, time is the number one. It's always, I don't have time to exercise. I don't have enough time. All right. But what we need to understand is physical activity doesn't need to be exercise, right? It's moving. You should have time to move. right? You should have time to be able to incorporate movement into your daily life. Another one, I don't know how to exercise. That's another common one that you hear. I just don't know how to exercise. And again, all of us have been moving, our whole lives we've been moving. We know how to move. And if you don't know how to exercise, you can get help, but you should know how to move. If you don't know how to move, then that is a problem in itself. But I don't know how to exercise. Again, you can break that barrier down just by saying, well, you know how to move, don't you? Because that's all you need to do is just move more. Okay, and it doesn't have to be exercise. It just needs to be movement. Exercise is too inconvenient. That's another one. I'm not fit enough to exercise. Exercise can be painful or dangerous. I get enough exercise at work. Exercise is too expensive. It's too physically demanding. I'm too old to start exercising. I don't believe in exercising. So again, all of these are barriers. All of these are barriers that people create for themselves. And what you have to do, and it comes down to first education and understanding. If you can educate them, help them understand exercise better, then they'll understand more, right? They'll understand and be able to knock barriers out, okay? I always, with someone who's not very physically active, someone who doesn't exercise but needs to start, I always start with moving. I just talk about moving, and they say, well, I'm not fit enough to exercise, or I'm too old, or it's so hard, it's too expensive. Always start with moving, because every one of us knows how to move. It's just some of us have got to the point where we just don't want to move anymore. We lost the desire because of several different things. So you start with moving and you work to exercise. Okay? Start small, as we talked about. So when it comes to managing our barriers to physical activity, we need to ask ourselves, or the people that we're working with, a few questions. First one, always, are you aware of the physical and mental health benefits of being physically active? Sometimes that's all people need to hear. The reduced risks of those diseases of civilization. Sometimes they don't know that. They don't know that physical activity and exercise could lead to reduced risk of that. That might motivate them enough, right? So first thing you should ask yourself or ask someone is that. Then, is there something about physical activity you do not like? Figure that out, right? Because for some people it might be, I don't like running, so I'm not going to be physically active. I don't like running. Because they think that's the only way to be physically active is running. And you can help them understand, well, you don't have to just run. There's other forms of physical activity that you can do. What changes can you make to reach the physical activity guideline, right? If you look at the physical activity guideline, 2.5 hours a week, right? It's not a lot. It can be done. But again, that's, like I said, that's just the 2.5 hours of exercise of that moderate to high intensity you need, right? You need to move throughout the day. You need to move more. We can't be just sedentary and then do 2.5 hours. Yes, there'll be some benefits, because if you go from not moving at all to 2.5 hours of exercise a week, there will be benefits. And maybe that's a starting point for some people, is let's just try and hit 2.5 hours a week and go from there. All right, and then just start teaching them about movement vitamins as well. What stops you from being physically active? All right, what stops them? What is it? Right? Is it fear? Is it, again, not knowing? Is it they are afraid? They're afraid of what people think? What is it? What stops them from being physically active? And then when are some opportunities to be physically active? That's a good question to ask, right? Because this starts the time management question. This starts helping people look into what they're doing throughout the day that may be stopping them from being physically active. Because you say, when are some opportunities to be physically active? Well, I work from this time to this time. I come home, I have dinner, I sit on social media for an hour, and then I go do this and this, and then all of a sudden it's like right there. Okay, what about that hour on social media? Is that something you can cut in half? Right? Is it something you need to do to decompress after work? Um, it's just questions like that and trying to figure out what's going to work best for your schedule and your time management. Now, how we can enhance our support to physical activity. One of the first things to do is figure out what the attitude towards it is. Is it positive? Is it negative? Because if you could get someone to have a positive attitude towards physical activity, it's easy to get them to be physically active. If they have a positive activity, if they have a positive relationship with physical activity, then they'll be physically active. Another thing to get people to do is reflect on the people, places, and things that support their physical activity. Right? Some people, they're not physically active because they don't have the support. Their family doesn't do it. Their family is, doesn't understand it, and it hurts their ability to be physically active. So sometimes we have to recruit our family members into the journey with us, get them more physically active. Right? Where you live plays a big role in that as well. Right? Like if you live in northern Saskatchewan where it's snowing 6 to 7 months of the year, it's a little bit harder to be physically active. You have to come up with different ways of doing it, right? So reflect on, the people around you or the people around them, the places they live, the places they go, what are their supports like? And then, of course, accessibility to facilities and equipment is important. But I'm starting to see now that you don't need a facility to work out with. I mean, there's so much remote fitness now. You can work out at home relatively easily. If you need direction, there are people that have remote fitness classes that you can do virtually. Like a lot of that's starting to come up now, and that's been tremendous because that is going to help people have access to fitness wherever they are, right? So consider that. What's your facility accessibility like? What's your equipment like? If you don't have any equipment, but you have a yoga mat, well, there's your space for exercise. Look at this virtual fitness class. You don't need any equipment for it. You can just do it. Okay, so helping people or yourself understand that just any type of support for physical activity is good. Now let's look at some of the main health risks of sedentary behavior. These are the ones that essentially excessive sedentary behavior is associated with. So this is when we don't do anything, no movement. We are sedentary for 6+ hours a day. We will see higher levels of blood fats, which is the triglycerides, and those are ones that we want to limit. Okay, physical activity will limit those because it will use them for energy. But if we don't use those triglycerides floating around our bloodstream, they will then find places to store. Sedentary lowers our levels of HDL cholesterol, and HDL is the good cholesterol. It's the cholesterol we want abundance of because that's what helps reduce the risk of plaque buildup, and it helps. HDL cholesterol is cholesterol that helps our heart, so we want high levels of it. Sedentary behavior drops it. Physical activity increases it. Okay, sedentary behavior reduces our insulin sensitivity. When we get into nutrition, we'll talk a little bit more about insulin sensitivity because it's an important thing to understand with nutrition and physical activity, but more for nutrition. So when we're sedentary, we reduce insulin sensitivity, which is just going to increase our risk for type 2 diabetes. We have poor bone health. That's just because we're not putting any gravitational stress on our bones. And one way our bones get strong and stay strong and stay dense is through gravitational resistance and gravitational stress. So the more we walk, squat, jump, run, the stronger our bones are going to be. Okay, sedentary behavior also increases blood pressure. Sitting in the same position for hours upon hours increases our blood pressure. So what we want to do is reduce sedentary time. And we'll go into this more in the next lecture, which is going to be movement, which is really about how we just cut sedentary life out of our lifestyle. Because that's what we want to do. We want to reduce these behaviors. We want to reduce them because of the negative side effect they have to our health. So just I'll leave you with a few right now ways to reduce sedentary behavior. All right, so make it acceptable to stand in the back of a classroom or at a meeting. All right, so if you want to stand, go in the back and stand in the classroom or at a meeting. Create active workstations. Now, a lot of you probably have heard standing desks, and that's another one. But personally, I think active workstations are far better than standing desks, because standing desks, if I sit for 8 hours, it's horrible. If I stand in the same place for 4 hours or for 8 hours, that's a little bit better, but it's just really changing the load profile from sitting to standing. And it's not about sitting, it's not about standing. It's about the load profile and changing it regularly. When the load profile stays the same, that's what causes the problem. So if I'm standing, yeah, there's going to be some benefits, but for me, I create an active workstation. My workstation is one that is dynamic and mobile, and we'll talk about that in the movement lecture, because I think a active workstation is key, and I'll give you some tips on that as well. Bike desks, to be honest, these are comical. I've seen them, and as much as I have it here as a suggestion, I guess for some people it may be the only option, but I mean, I'm not a big fan of these. But if you're someone who, who needs to move more, but doesn't have the capacity for some physical legitimate reason, then a bike desk is probably an alternative. But I wouldn't suggest bike desks for people who can move regularly. I think the active workstation will be better. And walking meetings is always good too. Just going for a walk and doing a meeting that way is effective, right? So it's just moving more. And that's going to take us into the next lecture, which is going to be on movement. And we're going to talk about more about sedentary, but we're going to look at more how movement is really the key throughout your day. Not just exercise, but just moving more. Just moving more. All right? Okay, everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, you can put them on the discussion topic for this particular lecture. I hope everyone has a great day, and we will talk soon.